Welcome everybody to another episode of Strife's Sanctum. My name is Citizen Strife, and this week we're going to dabble into one hell of a video game. One of the staples of the SNES era, usually considered one of the best, if not the best, games of all time, and one that stands the test of time thanks to things like speedrunning, randomizers, and the like. And I'm talking, of course, about Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. My introduction to this was probably many like others. You get Super Mario World bundled into the SNES. There was no way around that. But sometimes you'd actually get Zelda as well. I want to say Zelda was also bundled in. If not, it was probably like the first game I played other than Mario World. And those two are just magic. Mario World does everything that Super Mario Bros. 3 did, but to me, just better visuals, better style, a lot more free-flowing antics that you can do more things. Legend of Zelda, I wasn't that familiar with until I played this. I played the first one, wasn't like super into it. I played Zelda 2 and beat it. I'm pretty dang sure. This was at those times I don't remember actually beating a game legitimately, because I played stuff like Punch-Out and Mario, but, you know, I was 6, so bear that in mind. But this came out in 1991, 1992, and it is widely regarded as one of the best Zeldas. For me, it's my favorite. And a lot of it, when you're talking about Zelda, does kind of come down to the 2D versus 3D. And while Zelda has tended to stick to 3D and gravitated for the Ocarina of Time label, now onto the Breath of the Wild scale, I've always had a preference for the 2D. Because when you're talking in 3D, you're adding in a whole bunch of issues with the mechanics of trying to beat enemies, specifically like bats or things. In my biggest issue, less so the time it takes to complete a dungeon is larger. It's the scope of the puzzle involved. Now, puzzles can be in said room or a dungeon's full-on puzzle. And I'm not going to go into every single puzzle for every single palace, but it does stand to reason that whether it's a puzzle in a room, to get out of a room, to question how to get out of a room, because Zelda is all about the puzzles and the mechanics, much less the combat. The combat is there, and it's fine, and they all work great. But it's working out solutions, whether it be killing the enemies, doing all the other things, using the item, and this was right around the time, but before that items basically became mandatory to beat bosses. Not every item was necessary to kill a boss, and I remember a sequelitis episode where they mentioned an item from a fuck-off dungeon, being the ice rod, was the one that helped you beat Trinix all the way at the end. But there's also like game-breaking things. You don't have to go and complete one order. Later on, when you have items that you have to beat the game, yes, but there are some dungeons where you don't have to, and you can actually go out of order. I usually go out of order for Thieves Town to get the mitts, to do Smith's Chain and get the Tempered Sword first, rather than deal with Mothula first. And then taking care of Vidi before going to the Ice Palace because Cane of Samari, little things like that. You can choose to do that. And it's also strange to me watching people think through Zelda the first time and really getting a sense of like, oh my god, the aha moment. Because Ocarina of Time, yes, there are dungeons at play, but you can see them. You can see what the dungeon's going for a lot easier in 2D than you would in 3D. But as far as talking about Link to the Past, my overall thoughts of it, but I also want to dig into what the randomizer scene or the speedrunning scene does, and whether I stream it myself or have more intently watched YouTubers and Twitch streamers do it themselves, it is a favorite pastime of mine. So Zelda is something close to my heart. And what is nice about Zelda is the fact that as basic as a plot as it is, at least they give you one. There is a text crawl in the first game, but second game really didn't give you one. It was Zelda was asleep, and then you go to the dungeons, but then there's not really a lot. Mostly because of processing power. Zelda was the first time that you had characters almost like an RPG, because to me, Zelda is an RPG. I know that that's a somewhat controversial statement and whatever, but Zelda fits the profile of an RPG anyway. Link gets tasked by Zelda, tasked by Sahasrara, all the other people. You know where to go, but at the same time, there's always this sense you can experiment and see what stuff is going on. Knowing the progression makes things super quick, but at the same time, once you get out of that first castle, you can just kind of do a thing. You don't have to worry about what you're doing outside of enemies just being too strong for you. And it's a freeing feeling. They took what was great in the first game and expanded on it. The color schemes look amazing. Everything looks amazing. And then the plot. They give you enough of a plot to go on, and that's kind of been the staple plot for Zeldas for a long time. I would caution people against the idea that there's an alternate timeline and anything like that, mostly because I don't think the creators they don't demand it. This isn't a comic book or a comic book movie. This is a video game. And video games, there tends not to be too much continuity, because what if you do want to reboot it later? There doesn't have to be a continuity. So I tend to think that Zelda is its own thing, that was always meant to be its own thing. Maybe that's changed with Breath of the Wild and Hyrule Historia and, everybody talking about it on the internet and whatnot, but I don't think they set out to make a continuity. What they set to come up with was a story for you to drive Link forward, because Link himself is a dork face. He's a silent protagonist. He has no agency on his own, so he has to have plot around him. Zelda being kidnapped, the Seven Maidens being kidnapped, the Triforce in this Pure Land that has been taken over. A lot of the conventions that they expanded upon in Ocarina of Time were fleshed out in here, because we knew about the Triforce long ago, but we didn't know what it was and what it would do. The SNES, with its new processing and focus on story, allowed you to think, okay, these are characters now. These are people that are trying to stop us. The Aghanim and Ganon are trying to do things. They're not just evildoers. They're trying to corrupt the world. Things like that. Of course, later on, Ocarina of Time, more and more and more onto that, and adding in someone like Ganondorf, but having characterization for these people, having a character for Zelda, and Zelda's going through many, many, many changes. Link is Link. He's there. So that you have to build a sufficient story around a silent protagonist for me to give a shit. And thankfully, Zelda is so strong in so many other areas that even though a basic plotline is there, and it has its issues, Link doesn't come across as too much of a dork. Just enough that he's not unlikable, but he's committed to doing the thing. So he saves Zelda, then he has to go through the Dark World, all that junk. The one major problem with this game is when you're doing on repeats, and even if you play it for the first time and you save the maidens, you have that issue at the end of Dark World Dungeons where they're retelling the story of the Pure Land, and they just throw it at you over and over and over. The only time it's different is the 7th one in Turtle Rock with Zelda herself in it. You can't skip it. I know in randomizers they've allowed you to skip it. Thank God for that. Though there are some designs, there are some flags and some variations where they don't let you, and you have to go through that stupid rigmarole. Par for the course. I don't think they anticipated it would be so boring. I don't think people anticipated this to be such a boring thing, and this was long before the idea of skippable cutscenes, and skippable cutscenes didn't even happen until something like Metal Gear. So they weren't anticipating that, and I don't think they anticipated it to be as boring and as monotonous as it was. But they at least made an attempt. Make an attempt at doing something rather than not trying. But be aware that there are consequences when you do that. But you have enough characters to go on, enough things to do, and enough people to save. Because it's not just Ganon, Zelda, and Link. You have Sahasrara, you have the maidens, you have, other random people. You got the people on the top of Spectacle Rock who've changed into things, and the bullies kicking the ball. Weird stuff happens in Zelda, especially in the Dark World. So you have characters kind of dotting the landscape, but it's not full on like bustling world, but it's enough. I think there's enough. And the benefit is the Dark World itself being a very strange, unique place, that things that you saw in Kakariko Village now into Thieves Town ends up becoming just, why is this guy made of tentacle flowers things trying to bounce at me? Why is this giant throwing bombs at me? Why are these fucking buzzards the worst fucking enemy in the game because they do 3 hearts of fucking damage? Stuff like that. Things that were proper now are improper. It's a neat feeling. Turning fairies into fat fairies. Having fairies at all. Having Zoras be the evil Zoras before they turned into crazy mermaid elf people, which were, really cool. Merman elf people that were, high and mighty. Zoras were the evil Zoras for the longest time. So you had to duck and dodge through Zora's domain and, watch them kill you because you're bad at your job like I am. Little things throughout Zelda make the progression work. So all of the little items you get, all of the little unique skills, and Zelda is nothing without its skill set. Because without the trusty boomerang, you can't stun dudes, but you need the hook shot, and then you end up realizing that the boomerang is useless because the hook shot is amazing and just amazing. Cane of Samaria has some utility, and obviously speedrunning allows you to do some weird, crazy shit, like trying to get through Ice Palace without having to go through the first couple of levels because you speed through it with Icebreaker. Little cool things. And you get to use those mechanics as intended. It is like a 3 to 4 hour experience. If you speedrun it, I think people have done it in like an hour and a half, give or take. Maybe even quicker, because they know the glitches and they know how to make it work with vanilla. But for my purposes, as I played it, it took me about 3 to 4 hours, give or take. But it is an enjoyable experience to learn about what these things used to be, especially when you're so used to breaking logic with them. Like getting the hookshot for the first time, getting a new piece of armor, getting a new piece of the new sword, tempered sword versus whatever, because you learn that the bosses were designed in such a way that they will wreck your face if you don't. That's something I learned about the randomizer scene, is if you're stuck with the blue sword, a lot of the later enemies, Vitreous, for example, the 6th boss, is notoriously hard to bring down, so you kind of need a 3rd sword. You also kind of need blue mail or red mail to hold up, because those fucking eyeballs hurt a lot. Not everything is the same, but it's also cool to have stuff like silver arrows where you can one-shot dudes. That's one of the cool features of having that. But also going back and realizing that you can use whatever mechanics are at play, like using the ice rod to kill some of the bosses. Like, I wouldn't have known that. So you can still grab the ice rod early, use it on some bosses, or use it in some way that you probably didn't know. Or, say the mirror, using the mirror to break some blocks to get in, some of the areas. It filters into it. So you can take stuff that you've learned watching speedruns and apply it to the old school game, and it still works. Some of the glitches may or may not work because it purely has to be a Japanese version, but even still, knowing that stuff exists changes your mindset of how the items work, changes the value proposition of the items works, changes how the treasures are located and kind of what's the value. Compasses don't matter in OG. Like, unless you know where the bosses are, compasses are meaningless. Maps are fine, but, they're meaningless. But for first-time players, they're useful items that are just essential to get through things. And it is strange looking back on it, just how useful they are when you don't have access to those things. but nothing seems too hard. That's the cool thing I like about this, and something I'm not as fond of with Zelda 1, Zelda 2, because that was the NES era. The original Zeldas felt really difficult, even though, say, the bosses themselves weren't so bad. It's the dungeon enemies that always felt trouble. This is the complete opposite in this game. Other than a few overworld enemies and whatnot, Link to the Past is an easier experience in most cases. There are some enemies that do a shit ton of damage. There's some bosses that do a lot of damage, but they give you enough health and safeties. This was, I think, the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, but they had the whole fairy in a bottle mechanic where you're able to just stave off death. More people prefer using the potions, but fairies are there as a safety mechanism, especially someone like me who really doesn't prefer difficult games, as has been borne out from the way I play them now. So it is nice that you have something like the bug net and the fairy bottles and stuff like that they added into this thing as another, oh, I've been saved. It's like a save point in an RPG where you hit it and you're just like, yay, my progress has been saved. Very useful. The saving mechanic, which was introduced in Zelda, always nice. It's back here in Zelda 3, in Link to the Past, in a good way, because you don't want to lose your progress. It's really, really fucking dumb. But I think Zelda's nice about, if you do game over, you keep your items, so you don't have to redo. You have to redo sections, potentially, but you don't have to redo getting all the items, which does help. So progression never seems really problematic. And it has helped because when you're in the moment, you're wanting to listen to the music. And Zelda is home to a lot of great music. I think Ocarina of Time gets a lot of the credit for a lot of the better themes, just because at the time using an ocarina or a flute or whatever was integral to the plot, and then it became such a fixture that all these songs became magical. But I still think Zelda 1, Zelda 2, Link to the Past had their own classical songs, and they were beneficial. Some of the songs originated in this game, but then you had songs like Hyrule Castle, which have been staples. You have both world themes, the opening theme in the Light World, and then especially the Dark World theme, which is its own mystical adventure, but it's not so goddamn dark that it's Dark Death Mountain. When you hit Dark Death Mountain, shit has gotten serious, and things have gotten very good. And I think Zelda has always been good at making simple songs effective, much like Mario does. And that's something that, especially since I review music off and on my own time, I'm a big believer in catchy themes. I said this before in Final Fantasy X versus Final Fantasy XII or something like that, where I want the music to grab me in some way. I want the theme to instantly be recognizable, and something that when it's gonna loop, I can hum it in the background or remember it. The Clash on the Big Bridge or One Winged Angel, something that I can sink my teeth into. Moments that capture me. These Zelda songs capture me because they make sense. They're simple songs. Going into a dungeon, you know which dungeon you're in because it's the light or dark world. So it's always nice. Everything just seems like it fits well. There are some stupid glitches here and there, and I'll get more into that when we do the randomizer thing, but the puzzle design makes sense. Not all the time, but in general, when you go into a dungeon, you're faced with the room dungeon. Okay, but then you're faced with, oh, you got a key? Where are you going to use the key? There's 50 million different versions of the key. Palace of Darkness has key overload. So which key goes to what place versus how do you get to the thing? How do you survive the thing? What items do you need to survive the thing? And Palace of Darkness, I remember being notorious for just, where the fuck do you have to go? But when you realize where you have to go, and you have to kind of go back and forth through the area, it makes sense. Swamp Palace, not as crazy, but then Skull Woods is just dropping into areas and finding your way through it. little cool experiences. Every dungeon's different. Finding blind in thieves' hideout and making sure not to take them out of the thing, but take, cool little ideas that were at play that I would have never thought. Because me personally, I like something that's straightforward, so that I'm not like racking my brain trying to figure out solutions. You see this when I'm trying to play Phoenix Wright. I kind of use a guide. When I figured out stuff in Zelda, it was an aha moment. And again, that speaks to 2D. There's not so much visual information going on. There's enough centralized idea in a room or a dungeon that it kind of filters into your brain and gives you enough to go on without becoming excessive. That being said, some of the dungeons suck because they have too many keys for certain areas and they just lead to trap rooms. Misery Mire, Skull Woods, they overload on keys, making you waste them for things that don't matter. A lot of trap rooms exist. Desert Palace is a trap room. Ice Palace is a trap room. The trap rooms are dumb, and I hate them. Little gotcha moments that just sit there, so they're not fun. I already talked about the crystal speeches, which you can't skip and don't matter. But it is nice that everything does still fit, because the bosses, whether they require the item or not, whether they're weak to an item or not, they have their own feel to them. Not always. There are some that are notoriously annoying. Two in particular I hate the most. Moldorm at the top of Tower of Hera is annoying. You can use the magic cape, in a randomizer, I believe, but I don't know if you have access. You might have access to it, but I don't think logically you should. I don't think you have access to Cane of Burn. You shouldn't anyway. But in a randomizer setting, Moldorm becomes the bane of existence because he's trying to stop you and drop you off, yeet you off the platform. I remember, it's not even falling off the platforms that's so annoying. It's the one where he bounces you back onto the top platform because he hit you in the right way as you were falling down. I've seen that several times. But Moldorm is notoriously annoying, which is why he was changed in stuff like Link's Awakening to be way less annoying, right? Way less falling pits. But there's another one I hate too, and it's Mothula, because we found out that he can be damaged in the middle of the room, but if he's flying over spikes, he has an invincibility frame, which is really stupid. So he becomes the notorious enemy, not because he himself is doing the damage, but because the room itself is the real enemy. So they're not fun. But overall, Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past is something that is always going to be nice and always going to be fun. And like I said, introducing somebody to a game like this is a joy and a treasure, especially on Twitch, where a lot of the times there are a lot of people playing some staple games for the first time, and Zelda: Link to the Past is one of those. So how do you introduce them to that? Well, you play the first one the first time, or two, but then you can dig into the randomizer or the tournament scene. And I'm not really a racer very well. I don't like racing anyone. I'm not competitive. I don't like being competitive because I kind of get a little angsty and angry about losing. But I love the idea at play with Zelda randomizer specifically. There are others, and there are way more randomizers out at play than I even imagined. Like, every game you can think of probably has a randomized effect to it. Some are better than others, but Zelda has always kind of been that number one, and Super Metroid's been the number two. So much so that they've crossed together into what's known as SMZ3. And Zelda specifically works because of the amount of treasures that are at play. And for me, it's not really beating the game that's impressive. It's what item do you get that leads you to the next thing. And that's where all those cool, fun glitches and settings and all this cool stuff happens. They've always changed it around. They've always added in new sprites to use. Like, you can use Phoenix Wright as a sprite. You can use Cloud. You can use 50 million types of Link. You can use the angry video game nerd. A lot of weird memes. Probably use Homer Simpson. You could use Navi. You can use Vivi or a different Black Mage. There's so many different items you could use. You could use the fucking shrub from the Dark World if you wanted. So there are so many cool settings you can add to a randomizer. And it's the feeling of, oh shit, I just got an item that's really great, like the hook shot. Or, oh shit, I got something like the hammer or the mitts. Because you always need a certain amount of items. And once you learn which items give you what and what glitches you can do, and I'm not the best at them, so I'm not going to go overboard with them, but things like the mirror breaking some of the blocks so you can get into some areas you weren't supposed to, stuff like the Zora, breaking Zora 2 different ways. There's 2 different ways of breaking Zora, like there's 2 different ways of breaking Ice Palace. And there's constantly things that they're always finding out, whether it's in Metroid and Zelda or just the single randomizer. And that's why I've been able to experience something like Super Metroid, which I physically, just the way my hands are and the way, I tried playing SMZ3 and I cannot play Super Metroid to play my life, because it was physically harmful to play it. I'm pretty sure I'm one of the very few that believes that, but trust me, being a 35-year-old trying to play Super Metroid for the first time and not knowing how to do it was kind of So I do still enjoy the game, and I would never have experienced it if not for a randomizer setting. So if you're a fan of a game, say an RPG or something, I know Final Fantasy has randomizers as well, trying out a different randomizer gets you a different feel for the games that you loved, and you get to love the games all over again because it's not just the randomizer, it's the fact that you're taking a unique spin down memory lanes. You still get all these images of, oh my god, you're still living through the same story, but you're doing it in a different way. So I feel randomizers are cool, not just from gameplay perspective, but from progression and learning how to speedrun, learning how to do competitive stuff, learning things from players who are very experienced at this thing, learning things you never would have learned, learning you can use hookshot to take the Hera pot to teleport up through Tower of Hera. I would have never learned that. I would have never learned you could use the Cane of Samaria to warp your way through most of Ice Palace. Little things like that are cool that you just don't get to experience in the original setting. And that's what's cool about that, is it's not only learning the progression and learning what items do what, but just opening the box and saying, am I going to get the hookshot today, or am I going to get 10 arrows? That's the best part of a randomizer, is getting the thing and having the rush of adrenaline or just the crash back down to earth and the frustration involved, which you don't get from the original game. But regardless of the way you play a game, and I'm going back to Zelda specifically, Link to the Past is something that is something anybody could probably pick up and play, because it gives you enough of a story, it gives you enough of a reason to venture into a world. But for people who are less into people who are less into the story and more into the game mechanics, well, they give you a lot of mechanics and they tell you how to use these things and you learn how to use them. If you're into the adventuring part of the game, you're not really restricted in going to one area unless you have a certain item, so you can walk around the world at your leisure 5 or 10 minutes into the game and just experience these things, much like the original Zelda, on what I would consider a grander scale. So Link to the Past is one of my top 10 favorite games. I'm absolutely certain on that, for a reason. I love the 2D Zelda mechanic, and Link to the Past has always kind of been that absolute perfect mix of something simple and effective without feeling so expressive and so expansive that I get lost in the shuffle. But that'll do it for me today. Next week, we do Love After World Domination. And I've said this before, but this was a show that I didn't think would work at all. But everything about it just works in the scope of the show that it's trying to be. And you'll get shows or games like that once in a while. They're not amazing, but they just work. After that, actually, no, it's Paranoia Agent first. Paranoia Agent first, then 2 weeks later, it's Love After World Domination. Scratch that. So, Paranoia Agent, strange. Kind of a mindfuck. Kind of a thriller meets mindfuck meets a kind of psychological horror thriller thing. So we got Paranoia Agent, then we have Love After World Domination. In between those, as far as games go, the next time we play a game will be Sonic the Hedgehog 1991. And I had to make that distinction because Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 exists. But yes, we're talking about the original Sonic the Hedgehog. Rewatching the footage over again and replaying it here and there, it's fine, but we'll talk about it. And I think for Sonic and, most of the games in general, I think at least for the first 3, I'm going to do what I did kind of with Mega Man, where I talked about the bosses, but I'm going to talk about the zones themselves to differentiate them all and kind of give you a ranking of the zones. It's kind of a cool idea that I'm thinking of doing, going zone by zone by zone and talking about the music or the enemies or the visual design or even the bosses. And Sonic is a good way to start with that. After Love After World Domination, which, as I've said, is third, we'll do Soul Blazer. A nice start to the Soul Blazer trilogy. Not anybody's favorite game, but if you're going to talk about Illusion of Gaia or Terra Enigma, you kind of have to start with Soul Blazer because it breaks down the mechanics as that first game in the franchise before expanding on it. So we've got Paranoia Agent, Sonic the Hedgehog 91, Love After World Domination, and Soul Blazer. And that will keep us pretty busy for the next few weeks. But if you did enjoy this, as always, like the video, share it, subscribe it, notify, all that YouTube junk. But thank you guys so much for watching. Citizen Strife, signing off.